Hello, Eric.
Hi, Chelsea. How you been?
How good? How are you?
I'm all right. Um, Hopefully, we're all okay when we're having these conversations. I don't want to be in a bad mood or have anything really nasty happening. We want to be happy and
It's
positive.
beautiful weather.
It is.
Uh,
It's. We happen to record in springtime. Things are getting a little bit better and nicer, which is nice.
yes, yeah.
Um,
Nothing,
we have
nothing
been
too bad
talking.
happened.
We have been talking recently about different things in the news, and there's always something new. There's always new stuff happening, and we recently were talking about some high profile arrests that have been made of cyber criminals, mostly in other countries and other places by different agencies, and they end up working in other countries in many cases. And one of the intriguing things we came across is some of these guys are living a playboy lifestyle. They're making
Hmm.
crazy money, that they're profiting, that they've got showing pictures of themselves with stacks of cash and pretty girls and expensive cars and all these things that like they're celebrities. And I found that kind of an intriguing thing that we had a fun discussion about recently. Some of these articles, but you had a different angle that you were questioning about that too.
Well, yeah, so I mean, I find that very interesting as well. But then also, I had brought up to you the text messages going around about the toll, not paying your tolls and stuff, who these are all coming from, because everybody I know has gotten one. So we kind of were having a discussion about really who's behind this, who are the people actually behind this?
Just who are the bad guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of conflicting ideas. Hollywood has their take on who the bad guys are. We've seen this. We've talked about this in other episodes and in other conversations about how Hollywood depicts the hacker and whether or not that's the right term, or the bad guy or the cyber criminal versus what they really look like. And I think there's a lot of question around there. And I don't think a clean single answer to this one either. There's not one persona or stereotype criminal, cyber criminal. And I think it's a really interesting topic to explore, both from the different types of attacks, the different motivations, the different locations. I think there's a lot of different answers in there of who they really are. And to your recent point of some of the recent attack vectors, like via text, which we had a year or so ago, we had a lot of that through USPS notifications that you have a package to pick up, which were all fake and fraudulent. And now I literally within the last hour received a text message while we were talking about something else that said I had an unpaid toll. So
Yep.
I think those are really intriguing to dive into where they might be coming from. Um,
And I think it's really interesting too that the one you were speaking on before, I mean, he just looks like a young kid. So is it an organization? Is it just this young guy? Like who really is behind this? I think there's a lot of questions.
yeah. Well, one of the interesting things that the kid I think in the article you're talking about was a young kid who was arrested and cited as a developer for a ransomware business, an organization. So he's just a piece of it. And I think I'd like to learn more and talk more. And we happen to have a guest who has some great insight into this. He's done a lot of time, spent a lot of time, not done time, but spent a lot of time investigating from a forensic standpoint and incident response, which is a whole different topic we've talked about, but done some investigation in forensically where this stuff is coming from, building a good knowledge around the personas behind cybercrime, not quite into a profiling, or maybe he is, what you might consider a profiler. When you talk about serial killers and that they have profilers that just get into the mindset of the criminals and the bad guys to better understand what motivates them, and how they work and how they operate, which then may lead to better defending, which is
Hmm.
kind of our goal. So I don't want to steal his thunder or introduce him incorrectly. So Max, I'd love you to better introduce yourself and where your background lies in this area and why you're so interested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is what we call digital forensics and incident response, and um, worked my way up. I was the heads down, malware reverse engineer, right? Super technical terms. Now I'm getting to step back a little bit and look at this more as a widespread intelligence approach and talk about the ransomware stuff. Eastern Europe is really the hotbed there. Talk about the text messages, a lot more so out of Asia, and then there's some yeah, email compromise is really a global effort from that perspective as far as the criminal organization goes. And then there's actually some really cool North Korea stuff that I was going to talk about too. But on the ransomware front, you hear about this individual who fled Ukraine when Russia invaded, and it was really interesting where a lot of the criminals that comprised of these large enterprises, and I'm talking 200 plus individuals who are all working together, right? And that's just one group out of many. They hadn't met before, right? And they really had only talked to each other about hacking and targets. And so when some of them started to make geopolitical posts and alignment, you actually started to see the fracturing of these groups. There was a lot of splintering, and they've broken off into lone wolves. And you had the one individual who was somebody who was living a high profile life, started to flee. Well, they were tracking his license plates. They already had all that information. It's very tough to make an arrest in certain countries where you cannot extradite, right? And so they're tracking them. And as soon as that triggers on one of those license plate scanners, they know that they're in a territory that if they're able to make an arrest at that time, they can probably extradite and get them actually behind bars.
So
Interesting. So, well, I want to pause for 1 second, Max, and just have you, tell everyone who you're with. How does your job relate to this? You work for a company called Pondurance, and
Yep.
you're in a bunch of different spaces professionally, but is that what has led to this, or is this more of a personal interest and intrigue you spend your spare time on?
Well, I think it's both. So yes, I am with Pondurance. My opinions are my own, but I'm with Pondurance, and I've spent my whole career there, going on 11 years now. But I think what's made me successful in that regard is that it is also a hobby. I mean, if I'm on the weekend, if it's late into the evening, I have a certain group of friends who are always sharing intelligence, and for us, it's fascinating. You lose so much sleep doing these forensics engagements and helping hospitals, helping ERs who are out overnight. You're going to pull an all-nighter, right? Your sleep doesn't matter when it's life and death. And then when you're able to reflect on that and say, who was the person behind this? And there finally is an unmasking, right? And you say, okay, they were working out of this, very dark office, and it was snowbound, et cetera. It's like, okay, well, at least they were pretty miserable too. And then you get guys who there's videos and photos of them doing burnouts and Lamborghinis and all these custom paint jobs, living the opposite lifestyle, right? You mentioned the Playboy lifestyle. And I think those are the ones, because it's so flagrant and out there, those are the ones where I'm just like, wow, truly, this is how you're doing it when we're hurting. We're truly hurting over here. So
I mean, it's probably very much like corporate structure, where you have a hierarchy where there's executives at the top making all the money, doing less work, and then you've got the those of us doing all the work, putting in all the effort, working the 80-hour work weeks, living hopefully at least average lifestyles.
we're just making it.
So I mean, well, we'll get into more details on this, but I think, is it similar to that, where there's this corporate structure where some are doing very well for themselves and others not so much, but it's their job?
I mean, first, my CEO works very hard. Doug, if you're listening, I'll say that. But it's so amazing that you compare a criminal enterprise to a corporate structure, because it is. They have HR departments. I mean, there's rewards programs, there's incentive programs. You have basically managers who vet and interview these affiliates. And so if you think of it, there's a core for the ransomware groups, there's a core internal part of the company. And then they essentially have contractors who are making a cut based on what they're, getting in financial gain. So some of those are 90-10, where the person who's actually hacking the victim organization is getting 90% of the cut on the ransom payout. And that 10% is then going internally to that organization. They're hosting the chat rooms for you to negotiate with. They're doing the money laundering on payments that get made. They're doing the blogging, the posting. You steal a lot of data, you got to host that. There's infrastructure. It's wild. I mean, they hire engineers, the so-called journalists, and like you said, there are CEO figureheads who are out there basically handling the political maneuvering for that organization. And there's competitiveness. You have other ransomware gangs that are doing similar models and trying to have a more incentivized approach. And once one offers a capability that another one doesn't have, you'll see a competing ransomware group start to try and think and brainstorm different ways to make themselves a unique organization to join.
I have a million questions right off of the bat. Okay, so overall, would you say it is very much like a corporate structure where there is a bigger um, a bigger party controlling all of it, and then they are hiring individuals, and sometimes those are the people who go down. Those are the ones we hear about or know of.
Yeah, unless an affiliate is the one to take down like a very critical hospital or the gas pipeline that went down. But I'd say it's almost identical to a corporate structure without having, liability and insurance in the case of, something goes wrong internally.
Legal
Okay,
representation, maybe.
Yeah.
and okay, in regard to that, then where do you hire? Like, where do you go to find these? Where would you go to hire your talent? Or I don't know, we
Yeah.
call it talent, but
Well, it's funny because pen testing in cybersecurity is a legitimate field. It's a very amazing field that serves a very critical purpose. But when they go to hire their so-called talent, they promote it as hiring pen testers. And so, there's been some where, there's crazy stories where they say, oh, well, we're hiring talent that didn't know they were working for a ransomware gang, but they thought they were working for a real pen testing company. I don't buy it. But again, it's not really American based. It's not really Western Europe based. It is a lot of Eastern European so-called talent. And honestly, I'll recognize it. There's some real talent in what they're doing. Unfortunately, it's being used for very nefarious things.
I've said it for decades that good malware, successful malware, requires a lot of skill. Even back in the day of viruses, to write a virus that would actually propagate, that over a wide array, over a wide breadth, and replicate and spread before it detonated was a challenging thing to do and go unnoticed the whole while it spread. And it took a lot of developer programming, coding talent to do that. They just weren't using their powers for good. It's kind of this weird mentality and this weird idea of it takes the same skill set as you're getting at with pen testing, requires the same skill set as actually penetrating. It's testing versus succeeding. Just different goals, but the same tools, the same skills, the same knowledge. But I think to Chelsea's point, hey, how do you find them? And I think in the US, I think your answer, Max, is kind of it's not here. You're not going to monster.com and putting in your resume,
right.
yes, I'm a skilled cyber criminal. That's not going to fly. You're gonna raise some flags and get some attention you don't want. And we don't want to give advice to those seeking to work in cybercrime either, but or employ others. But I think a lot of it is probably coming from those other areas that we don't relate to as well in other countries where maybe they do have a help wanted section, and it's okay to seek cyber criminals because it's and maybe it goes to the motivation. Is it purely finance, or are there other reasons that, especially in some countries, you see these massive numbers of cyber criminals?
Yeah, what would be like the
Yeah.
main motivator that you've seen?
Yeah, so it is financial, and that's why a lot of these criminals are out of pretty hard hit areas, especially the sanctions with the U.S. against Russia. Really put a lot of them out of pocket in terms of money. So there was after things started to settle or at least balance a little bit more, so you started to see them really start to come after us. And what's funny too is it's not always just financial as it is like weather, right? So the strongest indicator of when we're going to get busy on the IR front is weather around Eastern Europe. And so you look at winter, man, when winter storms start to hit the Moscow area, we get busy. There's nothing else to do. They're not going outside. And then you look at springtime, right? Winter's over. They're going out and they're partying with their winnings, right? Things slow down in the spring. So, and then after, there's a little bit after spring, maybe they went and spent too much, right? And then they're like, okay, we need to recoup a little bit. So there is little pops here and there, but winter's definitely the time when they're going after it.
So that brings up an interesting point because I think we all have this idea of a hacker as someone who's just like hanging out in a basement, but that's basically saying that these people are, they're just everyday people. Like they're going out doing things. If it's nice out, they're outside. If it's winter, we're all inside. It's, how is that different? You know, it's not that really different from any of us.
Yeah, just like the private jet and the Lamborghinis that we take to go enjoy spring, right? Um,
Right,
but
all the time.
I must say it's not purely Eastern Europe, right? There's been different clusters. In fact, there was and still kind of is a small U.S. presence with a group called Scattered Spider. There was a few arrests that were made recently, and they're a younger group of individuals, but it definitely comes, in part from the U.S. But when it happens, you're much more likely to get not just indicted, but arrested when it happens.
I think you hit
Okay.
on an interesting point for me, and Chelsea and I are going to have to take turns asking you questions now. But you touched on the idea that sanctions and laws and other things, other political and worldwide issues change the cycle and lead to more or less. It made me think back to before my time, things like prohibition. Moonshining and bootlegging wasn't as big of a business until legitimate alcohol became a problem. Then it kind of fostered this whole criminal enterprise. And it's almost a similar thing to what you're saying is when we start reducing their ability to make money via legitimate means because of sanctions and other crackdowns, they have to find another way to keep the heat on. And I just find that to be an interesting kind of a comparison.
Yeah, there's a cause and effect for everything, right? So you get the takedown of a major criminal gang like Lockbit. There were 200 affiliates that were part of that. After that got taken down, I came to, I was like, yes, awesome. They took down the group that's causing me so much trouble. And then I realized that all the intelligence and all the expectations that I had whenever dealing with a Lockbit case were gone because all the affiliates started becoming lone wolves and pulling off all these attacks that we had no sort of intelligence to build off. And so every time something happens, whether good or, whatever, there is an effect that we are left dealing with. But it's also fun for me. You start doing the same thing, seeing the same groups over time. So when there is a change and new tendencies, it is nice to change that pace a little bit.
So you had mentioned age, um, and I'm curious now, for like lone wolves or kind of just most of the hackers you see, is there a trend in if they're older or younger, or if the lone wolves are older or younger?
Well, those are the ones I think are harder to track and get a little bit less focus from law enforcement, but they also make less money than a criminal group. So actually, I haven't seen too much on any of those getting unmasked. Whereas, and think of it this way, when you have a track record with a enterprise like Lockbit, and I can say, look, if you're going to make a ransom payment, I can tell you that 98% of the time it was successful in decrypting the environment. You get your environment back. This is a lone wolf. We have no idea. I've seen lone wolf cases where they get paid and just disappear and do nothing. Or they claim to have a copy of the backup of the data, they get paid to do nothing. And so when it comes to actually paying a lone wolf, there's no trust and you'll see a lot of hesitancy. And so I think for that reason too, like it's just not that I can't comment for law enforcement. It's just not where I see, the big arrests and indictments being made.
Yeah, it's interesting because if they're a lone wolf, they don't care as much about their reputation. They can go under a
Right.
different identity for their next job. The next ransom
Yeah.
they throw out there, they don't have to be identified as that one who didn't decrypt. Whereas the organizations, they need to maintain their legitimacy, in a sense of, yep, if you pay us, we'll treat you right. And if you don't, you go down. Because it's a longer term thing for them than the one off of a lone wolf. That's interesting.
I mean, it's kind of how you represent yourself in public when you're representing the company you're with, as opposed to when you're just representing yourself, right? Then.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's another area that kind of skates by in terms of where I see indictments, and it's a term called access brokers, right? And so the one who catches all the attention is the one who actually encrypts, extorts, and honestly, it's follow the money, right? That's how you really tie it all together. Access brokers, their entire role in this is just getting an initial foothold, getting an initial entry into a company, and just selling it for, $5,000, $10,000, and they're selling it to the affiliate. So you might have an access broker who was responsible for hundreds of incidents, and they just sold it to different affiliates. So over time, it just kind of dissipated. But crime by volume, right? They each have their own technique and get after it in that regard, and they're just not taking the main blame, but they're the ones who are really making it possible by getting that foothold.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the high profile and sometimes those arrests that are made just to kind of show progress. Authorities and law enforcement has to be doing something, so they try and have someone to hold out as an example. We caught this guy, but there's 199 other people that are part of the organization. They have no idea who they are, or don't have enough proof to actually indict or arrest or hold them at all. Like the HR person, to your point that they are fully organized and have different departments and different employees. What is that HR person doing that's going to get them arrested? Or are they doing anything that can get them arrested? Do they even know the kind of organization they're working for? So when we talk about some of those less high profile personas, what are they like? Or how are they finding them? And
Yeah, are
Well,
they taking down just one person or are they taking down everybody?
it's usually just one or a couple. And so there's another good example, and throwing you for a loop on this one is what North Korea is doing right now inside the U.S. What they're doing is they're applying for jobs, getting interviews, and when they're hired, they're getting the laptop shipped to a location in the U.S. And so there's these laptop farms right now in the U.S. And there's some with a house in Utah, North Carolina, Kentucky, et cetera. And you have this house with hundreds of laptops. Well, the only person who's getting arrested is the person who's working those laptops in the house. But they're not actually getting to the people who are in North Korea who are actually fake working these jobs. And if you followed what they're doing, they have all these laptops working together to fake do the bare minimum amount of job, collect a paycheck, and they're just getting paychecks for high paid jobs and shipping that money back to North Korea to fund the nuclear weapons program.
I actually have, and I have to be careful how much I say here because this is literally in progress. I have a friend with that kind of issue at their company where they are suspicious now that someone is not really a full employee because they were hired remote. They've only ever worked remote. And there was some potential evidence to this that has them suspicious. And I raised flags to them saying this is not just a personnel issue. It's not just an HR issue. And you're maybe paying an employee you're not really getting value out of. There could be something much more nefarious going on. So I've kind of started that conversation with them to get a little more involved with the potential cybercrime that's a much bigger deal than the payroll they're spending that they shouldn't be. We'll talk a little bit more about that offline and share more. I want to connect with these because to me, it's a lot more scary than it is to them. And I'm trying to make sure they understand that.
That's crazy though. So are they getting these jobs under their own identity?
So they're stealing identity. So they're taking a driver's license and superimposing the photo of the person who interviews on that. And so when you run the background check of the person so you're just looking at the information on the driver's license, right? And then you're saying, oh yeah, that photo looks like it lines up with the person who's on camera. And then what happens is they'll email you and say, hey, I'm actually moving. Instead of shipping to the address on my driver's license, can you ship it to this address? And it's a laptop farm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Interesting.
And what they do right away is they usually take bereavement or PTO or sick time. They install a remote tool and someone back in North Korea is doing the bare minimum to make it look like they're performing the job.
That's wild. I did not know about this at all.
What kind of volume
That's crazy.
or do we know of? How prevalent and common is this?
Pretty prevalent. It's mostly IT jobs, and high paying, like on the engineer side.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's surface money just from the pay for doing minimal work, but the bigger issue is what they're then gaining access to within that organization. And that's, I think, the bigger, scarier thing, or is it purely just fake jobs?
For the most part, it is fake jobs. Now, if you are something that's of interest to North Korea, they may poke around a little bit, right? They may say, oh, this is actually on my list of targets. Government-based, DoD-based, sure.
So relevant question, why is this not like talked about more?
There's been CrowdStrike had a really good article on it, and you'd think it is. It's made a few articles, but it's like organizations don't really give it much attention. They say, "Well, we would never hire that. We know how to spot a deep fake or a fake interview." And then it happens, right? It's never usually the cybersecurity department that's making the hire. That's pretty obvious to them. But some other department may rush through it and just, trying to find a qualified candidate, just make the hire, move on, and then a couple weeks in, they say, "Well, they haven't been on camera yet," or they hop on camera and they say, "Well, that's not who I remember interviewing," and there's a lot of background noise going on in that place.
Okay.
Yeah, it is incredibly intriguing and scary, but it's also been facilitated by work from home and work remote. Prior to the pandemic, it probably wasn't nearly where it is now because you had to bring people in that you couldn't physically meet. And now it's just the standard thing. You can hire people in remote locations. You don't even have anyone in their vicinity that can go meet with them before hiring them or even after to verify that they're real. So we've kind of made this bed for ourselves that there's no more physical verification.
Isn't that kind of ideal for a hacker to get employed by a company that they want to do something malicious to, the work from home aspect?
Yeah.
No in-person
and that's what, China. So if you think, I kind of categorize different countries as after different things, right? Russia, often financial, North Korea, financial. Russia's definitely wants intelligence too, but China's really on the intel side. And that's where you see China take a lot of action. But China's had some cybersecurity issues too, where, you talk about the text messages. I don't know if you've seen, I think CNN did the article on it. The text messages, the ones that text you and say, "Hey," or "Hi," and try to say, "Oh, this isn't the right person," but they develop a relationship. They tied that back to, it was a lot of Chinese nationals and different nationals around the Asia area that thought that they were traveling to Thailand for a job. And overnight, they were stuck across the border to Myanmar and thrown into a prison camp that basically forces them to send text messages all day. And there's been a huge series of raids and whatnot across Asian countries into those facilities and freeing those individuals. So when I learned that, there's so many people that would say, "Oh, look, I messed with this person who was texting me." And after I learned that, I was like, well, that might be a victim themselves who's texting you, who's basically being forced under, harsh situations. That one is what blew my mind when I learned it.
That's wild.
Yeah. That just blew mine. So
yeah, but it makes sense. And I can see that happening. It's an easier way to hire, just arrest them under false pretenses and force them into a labor camp where their labor is cybercrime.
Yeah. Well, the biggest enterprise though is the email compromise. And that's one. So just for numbers' sake, we talk about a ransomware group having 200 plus affiliates. This group mainly looks to do financial fraud through invoice, wire, ACH fraud. I'll talk about that in a second. In 2019, they had 281 arrested, not indicted, arrested, 281. The next year, the number of incidents for that rose 65%. So down 281 people, they then still increased 65%. And really what they're doing is they're just moving through, they're phishing, right? They're sending phishing emails, stealing username, password. They log in, they search for the word invoice, wire, ACH, and then they email whoever's supposed to pay that and say, "Hey, can you update the bank account to this?" and send it. And that's the whole scheme. And then they just walk into a victim. They say, "Is this a viable path towards financial fraud? If not, send phishing emails. If so, send a PDF saying update the information." And it's in the billions of dollars of what they've stolen per year. And that's a global one.
Interesting.
That's insane. We've talked a lot about the corporate side and hacking companies and organizations that have deep pockets, but I know a lot of this goes on the smaller scale as well. And there's a lot of individual consumer fraud that happens. Is it the same groups that target consumers versus corporate, or is it just, they're just targeting anyone, and then based on who they get the hook into, they take on different, take different direction?
You ready to bring this full circle? The group that is doing that email fraud, they have a subcluster that focuses on romance schemes. The romance schemes, so you're joining the dating apps, right? Tinder, Hinge, etc. And they're building relationships. They're building remote relationships over time. And what they do is they say, "Hey, I'm actually out of the country. Can you go into the bank and sign off on this wire transfer?" And it's the wire transfer that's associated with the email compromise scheme that needs to be signed off so that they can move money overseas. That's how big that organization is, and it's in so many countries. And so it's a lot of them still are tied into it. A lot of them still are tied into different consumer fraud, yes, but there's a lot of different subclusters of criminal groups. Still a lot of look at the Twitter hackers, really young individuals who just try to get creative and launch quick win Bitcoin schemes and whatnot. But the truth is that there's at some point there's a blend between it, but there's also an absolute organized aspect to a lot of it.
So they're that organized that they've got different departments, let's say, that are going after different avenues, because you need multiple pieces to fall into place to pull off a true large scale cyber heist.
Yeah. And when they're sending the entry level individuals as the romance scheme. So they say, "Oh, you want to come to the bigger scheme where we're actually doing the invoice fraud? Well, you need to spend your time doing romance schemes first."
Got to work your way up. Hire from within or promote from within.
I remember the first time hearing about the fact that most like cybersecurity scams, the groups are run like an actual corporation. But so it's crazy to hear it so in depth. Like, no, it really is. Like, it really is a
career path
corporation
within that organization that you can advance and
yeah.
Well, even then, again, we talked about different skill sets at the beginning. We talked about the kid that had fled Ukraine, who was cited as a developer. His job was to write the code, to write the malware. And there are other people doing different things. There are those who then do the social engineering aspect, which is really what email and texting is. It's a form of social engineering digitally. And it requires a different skill set and different personality traits and types, which is intriguing that they've organized and gotten together to work as a team and admit, I can write nasty code, but I'm not going to be able to get it installed anywhere. Somebody else has to kind of do that, and they do have to work together, and they've figured out how without having a traditional corporate structure. And it's intriguing that they've learned to work together, because, you watch any Hollywood stuff on criminals and heists. How do criminals trust other criminals, or can
That's
they?
I was gonna say, is there someone who's designated to take the fall, like a hierarchy among them, where it's like, if we go down, you take that?
Nope. They will, again, honor amongst thieves, but when it comes down to it, none of them want to be in jail. They'll throw each other under the bus when it comes down to it. But you look at that individual who fled to the Netherlands, and I think it's the same one that we're talking about. The rumor that I heard is that his significant other tagged him in a social media post, and that's how they knew where he was at that time. And they just stormed in and arrested him. But no, there was a group. I don't create these names. They call themselves. I think this was Alfie, or no, it was another one. But anyways, one of the individuals posted a pro-Russia sentiment post, right? And somebody else who was pro-Ukraine said, "Screw this, screw you," and leaked everything, all their chat rooms, all their malware, all their builders, all their affiliates, everything behind the scenes, just leaked all of it. They've never met.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild.
Back to one of Chelsea's earlier questions, when we mentioned the text messages, and you brought it up as well, different text messages for different purposes. Some just trying to get somebody to respond and maybe build a social connection. Others trying to get people to click links to claim their package or pay their automated tolls that failed. One of the things that we talked about, Chelsea and I did, was sometimes you get a lot of these. Sometimes you get one. But most of the time you end up getting inundated. And then over the coming weeks, you probably get more and more of them, which made me think they're not really well organized. And they're coming from different individuals, and different groups are maybe getting the idea that there's this vector, and they're all trying to take advantage of it, which is doing them all a disservice, because once I get 5 of these a day, I know they're all fake. Whereas if I just got one and then a couple weeks later got another, I might fall for it because it seems like it might be more legit if it was better organized. So does the pure volume sometimes lead to a little bit less organization that might actually hinder their efforts?
I think for those, and I haven't seen where, and I don't even know if it's been answered where it's originally coming from. So a lot of those I would classify more as like script kiddies. It's very obvious, right? Some of those texts that are coming across from a foreign number and going to a random website. What I suspect is that somewhere on some forum there's been like a leaked mass texter and a format or a way to kind of basically like a playbook to follow, and I suspect that multiple people are following that. But that doesn't really align with what I usually see out of like this bigger group that I'm talking about with like the romance schemes. So I do suspect that that's
That's
probably
what I was.
yeah, I don't
Yeah,
think it's the same.
and script kiddie, for those who aren't sure, it's DD, not TT. We're talking about script kids, children. It's just a somewhat derogatory term for someone who's kind of just getting their feet wet in cybersecurity and trying to download code or scripts and target whoever they can. And that's what this does feel like. It's very low sophistication, but I'm not going to click on the links and chase them down either. Uh, but I
Yeah,
think
like
When
they're often easier to identify because they're sloppy.
I guess now that I've insulted them, I
when
should
you
probably
talked
change my
about
number.
They know they're script kiddies.
when you talked about the romance scheme, are you like actually talking about dating apps as where they're like
Yeah.
getting people, scamming people? Okay.
Yep.
Like listen up, people.
Yeah, there's a story here. So I'm out of Tampa. There's a story of an individual out of Tampa. It's that one's a really sad story, and basically it was a sort of a different scheme. It wasn't the one to sign off on the wire transfer. This is one where they actually convinced the individual to send their whole retirement account, and now the individual can no longer retire and is work. I believe it's working on the Lowe's until the end of time. So those are really sad ones. Like it when you target an individual, right? Targeting companies is still you put them in really bad situations, but it's not the same as emptying out somebody's retirement account when they're at the point of retirement. Those are the ones that hurt me.
Yeah, I think, and we talk about media and Hollywood a lot. I did a couple times already today, but there was a movie, and I'm not going to. I hate spoilers. I'm not going to give anything really away, but there's a movie called Beekeeper recently with Jason Statham, and it's more of an action revenge flick. But the revenge is set up by that type of a cybercrime where it was just an individual gets, you know, impacted dramatically, and it leads to a whole not really cyber based movie. But it was a very good example of the anatomy of how this can happen and how it seems like how could they be so stupid, but they weren't. They're very good. These groups are very good at making the story believable, enticing you, dealing with the objections, keeping you on the hook, keeping you from doing the things we know that you should do. But you can watch it from outside and say, "Wow, how did they fall for this? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that?" And victim shame them almost to a degree. Um, but I think we've started to see more realistic depictions by Hollywood as well. Like at least the anatomy of this was correct on the back end. And I kind of want to ask your opinion on this. I don't know if you've seen the movie,
Mm-hmm.
but on the back end, they show it like it's a call center where there's all these operators with headsets on taking all these calls from anyone who clicked the link or returned the phone call. And then there's the one guy kind of running it who's very slick and expensive suit walking around like he's, like he does on the place. Um, and I believe, and I think we've talked about, that's not what it looks like. They're sitting at home in various places in various parts of the world, just kind of doing their job. Do they have, maybe this is one way I'll phrase it, these organizations that we say are well grouped and well organized, do they have headquarters? Or are they all just spread out? And
Some of them do have brick and mortar. They do use call centers. I don't know that they're in the U.S. I don't know that they look like what's in the movie, but they do use call centers. And the call center may not always be as in on the scheme. They may not always be the technical one, but they're facilitating it. And one thing that they're also using it for is harassment. And so you look at ransomware attacks, they leave a note. What they're also doing now is harassment. So some of them will register you with a call center, and it's not anybody who's affiliated with the group. They're just reading a script. But what they're saying is, number one, to the employees of the company, you need to pay us. But they will email that company and say, here's your top 3 clients. They're next that are getting a call. Here's their phone number. You can check your records. Right? That's where you start to see it gets pretty dicey.
Nasty.
So question, from the profiling like aspect of it, do you see a significant difference in the people who target individuals and ones who target companies, or is it there's no real trend to it? Or
The individuals are more so that larger enterprise that I talked about, and it's really more so like a subcluster of it. So the romance scheme absolutely targets individuals, and then you'll see various get rich quick schemes. Talked about the Twitter hacker, right? That was pretty obviously targeting individuals. I don't know that anybody really paid that, but I would say that compared to like the ransomware enterprises and the email compromise enterprises are going after companies. There's obviously a much more lucrative financial gain there when you start talking about insurance policies. You start talking about invoices that get paid compared to emptying out a 401k at scale.
okay.
So if I try to get this straight now and kind of reel it in, it seems like there's no distinct age group. We might see younger people in general learning and doing younger type activities. As they get older, they get more skilled, of course, but no real locking in on the bad guys being of a certain demographic. Location-wise, we've got domestic, but mostly probably foreign. In certain regions where either because they've been motivated to by political circumstances, weather, other things, financial, they're more motivated to do these things, or even political motivation, which I know, and we're not going to get into this here. We have other plans to talk about nation state cybercrime and attacking, which is motivated by things beyond just financial gain. And that leads to a whole different persona as well. But there's not really a very limited personality profile of who a cyber criminal could be. It could be anyone. They could be an HR person just working for an enterprise that does these things. So knowing that the attackers are very broad and very different in nature and have different skill sets, what can we do to defend ourselves? Or can we? Can this information help us in some way when we're either trying to identify whether something is legitimate or not, or how we carry ourselves and conduct our business or our lives to reduce our likelihood of being attacked?
Yeah. And first, I'd say even the ones who are in their 40s, you look back, they started at like age 12, 14. First is I see so many organizations that purchase shiny tools, and the best intelligence I've ever gotten are when you have an expensive tool, but nobody's watching it. It's like, well, thank you. You've accumulated quite the evidence for me to analyze. So it's monitoring, it's being able to apply context. You can apply, very much hardening with how you're limiting what can even get to yourself or your organization. But at the end of the day, things will get passed, and being able to catch those before it does get too bad is going to be key. Always know that everything that you're receiving or anything that you may observe that is malicious, they're there for a reason, right? A user didn't just get phished just to get phished. There's a criminal in there who's after something. And whether, that's financial, whatever, you need to stop that and understand the context and implications of where you're at in that actual compromise. But all in all, it's resilience, it's defense in depth. They're not slowing down. You look year over year, records get broken in terms of financial loss, and it's just going to continue to grow. So be prepared for that and grow with it.
Yeah, they talk about proving a crime through motive and opportunity, and evidence is all part of that. And you can't eliminate all of them. You can reduce motive by reducing the size of your target. You can reduce your footprint, your exposure to some degrees, but there will always be some other vector, some other angle somebody will take, and you can't eliminate the enemy.
Stay vigilant, right?
That's another thing we've talked about is as cyber defenders, it's a defense only game. We can't go lob volleys back at them to try and stop them, other than legally. And I think that's maybe what we started the conversation with, is talking about how they do take down some of these guys sometimes, but I think it's a very, very minor, almost kind of unimpactful percentage that do get taken down. I'll ask one other question, and we kind of need to wrap it up, but I just kind of remind myself a question I had is when we talk about law enforcement getting involved, are they involved enough? Should they be involved more? Because we talk about crime, and normally our defense against crime involves law enforcement. And yet it's always kind of struck me that cybercrime, there's very little they can or will do. And is there a reason for that? And, you may not have the best answers for it, but I'm curious if you have a take on it.
Well, you got to remember their role, right? They're going after indictments and arrests, and they're trying to take down the criminal. And so when it comes to helping the victim, that's where industry, my industry, people like Pondurance come in and help the victim. We relay our intelligence to organizations like the FBI to give them the power to go do what they need to do. They're taking a step back and saying, is there any alignment between what we're seeing in this case, to indicate that we can tie this back to an individual or set of individuals? So if you think that they're going to walk in and save the day, most times it's not going to be their role. If they do have, like sometimes you look at the takedowns, they get inside the infrastructure and they have to time it right with taking down that enterprise. But in the meantime, they may have their hands on like a master decryptor. So very, very low percentage of the time you'll actually get one of those. But otherwise, there have been cases where they'll knock on the front door and sometimes it'll scare the organization, but probably rightfully so. But you look at CISA has saved the day many times on different enterprises that I've worked with by saying, hey, it's imminent, it's coming, we see it. It's on you though to hire somebody like Pondurance and get in there and remediate it.
Yeah. Well, again, it's personal security. If you go to the analog physical world equivalent, having good locks on your doors is one thing, but it's also different in the sense that if somebody does break into your house and steal stuff, that's a local crime. And local law enforcement is responsible. In this case, the criminal who's breaking in is potentially on the other side of the world. And local law enforcement, even federal law enforcement, has no real authority to do much. So actually protecting is impractical or enforcing. It's interesting. I think that's going to have to lead to more international cooperation to really have an impact. I think we've seen that with some of these takedowns we've talked about. That getting those individuals that live in other countries that have different sheltering and protections is a challenge.
But getting to see all of this behind the scenes, I mean, it sounds fascinating. Like, I'm like, you can call us anytime that you want to discuss any of it, because this sounds like you have great stories that I would love to hear.
Awesome. Thank you.
Understand your adversary. Very cool. Well, that's great. If any other questions, Max, any other thoughts, closing, parting comments or questions for us or things you'd like to leave people with, or have we covered it all?
I feel like every time I talk, people leave scared. So yeah, the future is bright. We're getting better. The industry is getting better. Tools are getting better. So there's definitely hope on the horizon. It's just, be ready to mold and grow with it because the adversary will adapt. We just have to adapt with them. And it'll always be hand in hand, step in step with how we keep growing.
I think that's a good point. And one of the leave behinds might be don't put your head in the sand. Don't ignore it. Don't just be overly, thinking that we can't do anything about it. We can't stop it. We'll just do our best. Do your best, but leverage help. There's a lot of help out there as well. And besides just research and reading, leverage organizations that can help you be better prepared. And then to deal with these things after they happen. And again, knowing your adversary only helps. Chelsea, anything else?
No, I agree with everything.
Have we kind of answered our question of who exactly are the bad guys? They're everybody? Or
I'm like, anybody.
It's a hard one to nail down, and that's kind of why we like to ask these questions that don't really have a finite answer, but lead to a great discussion, which I really thank you for, Max. It's been very insightful and intriguing.
Yes, very intriguing.
Awesome. Thank you both for having me.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, Chelsea, until next
Eric,
time.
until next time.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye, guys.